Hello, biology students. We are going to jump right into chapter 11 on the circulatory system. We just finished up the last chapter on tissues, and we're going to jump right into this. So we're going to go through kind of the overview. Obviously, circulatory system is responsible for circulating things through your body. So I think the name explains it pretty well. It's pretty self-explanatory. But there's a lot of little pieces and lots of stuff that happens with this. So we are like, and they show this picture of like a highway system. So how a highway system is responsible for moving things throughout our world and throughout our country. We have this whole infrastructure sort of in our bodies that moves all the needed things from one part of our bodies to another. So we're going to talk about blood and what happens in that circulatory system. We're going to talk about the heart, blood vessels, veins and artery, and so on, blood flow and blood pressure regulation, and kind of how that those occur. We'll mention homeostasis and how homeostasis is maintained in the circulatory system. So in the circulatory system, we're going to talk about the heart, blood vessels, and I said veins and arteries. Kind of the big overview. It's your circulatory system and blood are responsible for bringing nutrients to cells and also for getting rid of waste. And again, this is part of that homeostasis process, maintaining levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrition, and so on. Blood is refreshed in the lungs, kidneys, intestine, and liver. And then we'll talk about the lymphatic system too. Lymphatic vessels help this system by collecting excess fluid surrounding tissues and returning it to that cardiovascular system. I did mention blood pressure, transporting blood, exchanging nutrients, and then that regulation of blood flow. Overview of an outline kind of the important functions of the blood. And again, already mentioned oxygen and nutrition has to get transferred throughout the body. So when you eat your food and it begins to be broken down in that digestive system, obviously it has to get to all the parts of the body. So your blood and your blood vessels are kind of responsible for that. There's also waste, that waste that needs to be filtered out has to leave the body. And waste can be that carbon dioxide, but we also know our kidneys, filter waste out as well. And there's hormones that travel through our body, those chemical signals. Blood is also part of our defense system when we talk about the white blood cells. We mentioned that a little bit in the last chapter with the tissues. And so they're an important line of defense for our bodies. And then regulatory functions. Again, that homeostasis function, maintaining body temperature, maintaining water and salt balance, that's sodium, maintaining proper pH, which is different in different parts of the body. So the blood functions in all of those processes. Components, remember, blood is a fluid connective tissue. We mentioned that in the last chapter. And there's some, that liquid connective tissue. So there's a couple of, we have a couple different types of bone marrow. We actually have red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. In the red bone marrow is where we see red blood cells or erythrocytes being formed, and also the white blood cells or leukocytes being formed, and those platelets, which are necessary for clotting, and we'll talk more about that later. So we also have something called plasma, and plasma is important in other components. And we'll talk about plasma in a little bit more detail later. Yeah, we'll come back to that. All right, so red blood cells. Red blood cells in general are these, I always say they look like donuts with a little hole in the center, but the hole doesn't go all the way through. So those red blood cells or erythrocytes, the reason it's sunken in is once a red blood cell matures, it actually loses its nucleus. So these actually don't have a nucleus. That's why they have this donut shape, which we call a biconcave shape, which incidentally also serves to increase the surface area, and it makes them more efficient at carrying things like oxygen. I'm going to move this so we can read that bottom part. I'm just in the way. I think this is the same visual that I showed you in the tissues chapter where we see the different kinds of cells. Notice that these, the white blood cells, so neutrophils, monocytes, lymphocytes, and so on are much larger than the red blood cells. And then these platelets are very, very small and kind of irregular, like not super irregular, but they're not like a nice round shape like we see red blood cells, and white blood cells tend to be more that way. And the different types of white blood cells they're all important in the immune response, but they all kind of have different jobs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. So red blood cells also, so this is only red blood cells, each cell contains about 250 million hemoglobin molecules that bind to 4 molecules of diatomic O2 oxygen each. So that's an incredible amount. Think of each cell contains 250 million. So that's like times 4. That means that each red blood cell can carry about a billion molecules of oxygen. So that's pretty incredible. We have lots of these red blood cells. We go through lots of molecules of diatomic oxygen when we breathe. So they're very, very important. And it's this hemoglobin again just makes them so efficient at the oxygen actually binds to this hemoglobin. Production of red blood cells, again, we already said produced in the bone marrow, in the red bone marrow specifically. They live about 120 days. And we have something called erythropoietin, or EPO, that's excreted by the kidney cells, moves to that red bone marrow when oxygen levels are low. Our liver, we always hear about the liver, especially, breaking down toxins, breaking things down, sort of like a filter kind of thing. The spleen also, the spleen is an important part of the that lymphatic system. So old cells are destroyed by the liver. And then the EPOs, and I shouldn't bring up names, but Lance Armstrong actually got in trouble for, I'm pretty sure this is what he was doing, the blood doping. And blood doping is injecting those erythropoietins prior to athletic events, and it's supposed to give you extra stamina and so on. And so yeah, he who had, I don't remember he won how many Tour de France's, and then, somebody kind of brought that up and said, hey, he's not really playing fair. That's an unfair advantage. All right, and then white blood cells. By the way, just apologize, I'm wearing a jacket and it is freezing cold in my classroom. I don't know. It's snowing outside as I'm recording this, and I don't know if they shut the heat off because you guys aren't here. I'm not sure. Not sure what's going on, or if it's just, I'm being punished. I don't know. Anyway, white blood cells. So remember I said there's like several different kinds of white blood cells. We kind of can lump them into 2 categories. We can lump them into granular and agranular. And honestly, if you look, you can kind of see why they're called granular. When we look at them under a microscope, they actually look like they have granules in them. The neutrophil, eosinophils and basophils, where the monocytes and lymphocytes definitely, appear to be agranular or have no granules in them. So it's just sort of, they're just a couple of categories that, and they have different jobs. Granulocytes are typically those first responders during injury or infection. So, you cut yourself or get some sort of fungal infection or whatever. It's going to be the granular ones, that the granulocytes that respond first, where the others can differentiate. So they can differentiate into macrophages and dendritic cells, which respond also to infection and injury, but not necessarily like the first on the scene. They're not going to be those first responders, but still very, very important. So structure of white blood cells. And again, several different kinds of those blood cells. So we already said they come from bone marrow, so some of this is repetitive. They come from that red bone marrow. They're much larger than red blood cells. They always have a nucleus. They can be found in the blood, but also in tissues. Tissues get injured, and those white blood cells, we can find those in there. They're infection fighters. If you go to the doctor and you are sick, a lot of times one of the first things they do is check your white blood cell count, right? So if it's elevated, that indicates some things, and I think we've talked about this a little maybe in the last chapter. So if your WBC, or white blood cell count, is elevated, that indicates that there's probably some kind of infection going on that your body's trying to fight. And to do that, it builds up that arsenal of white blood cells. Conversely, they also are very alarmed if your white blood cell count is low, because that can mean something else. It can mean an autoimmune disease. It can mean cancer is destroying your white blood cells. So things like lymphoma, for example, would be a type of cancer that would indicate that. So sometimes they're, with white blood cell checking, they're looking for it, whether there's elevation or whether it's lower than it should be, because they can both indicate some pretty serious health problems. So all over the board on how long they live. Some have very short lives, just a few days. Some live very, very long lives, months or even years. So it depends what sort of that job is of that white blood cell. Platelets, these are really important in blood clotting. So if you get an injury, I'm not sure if you could see that, but I had a little pop up there. If you get an injury, a cut or something like that needs to be repaired, these platelets are really important in that clotting of the blood to stop the bleeding. And if you don't have enough of these, so people who have the disease hemophilia do not have adequate amounts of platelets, they are not working correctly, and they can have a pretty minor injury and bleed to death if their platelet counts are really low. So this is kind of a fascinating little process. So there's blood proteins, specifically thrombin and fibrinogen are important for that clotting. It's really cool. It's sort of like there's some fibers that kind of these actually fibrin threads that kind of help. I don't know, almost like if you put a filter over things and they kind of weave it back together. Very, very effective at fixing those injuries. And the last little thing I'm going to talk about here. So this is that megakaryocyte, and you can see the little pieces. I always think they look like something that went through a cheese grater, right? So those are those little platelets coming off of there. And those are important in clotting, along with, here's those little fibrin fibers that are going to sort of stop that bleeding while it stops the blood loss while this wound heals. And I think that's it for today.